She was the black sister they rarely spoke about. But at her parents' funeral, she stepped forward and revealed a secret no one was ready to hear. The chapel smelled faintly of lilies and old wood polish. A sacred stillness hung in the air like a thin veil. Mourners filled the pews, dressed in stiff black suits and tear-soaked dresses, whispering condolences, dabbing at their eyes, desperately avoiding the kind of silence that made grief too real. At the front of the room, two urns sat side by side, one silver, one pearl white, surrounded by framed photos of a smiling couple, Charles and Margaret Bennett. Pillars of the community, faithful churchgoers, the kind of people others called a blessing to all who knew them. But now, no one was looking at the urns. They were looking at her. Standing perfectly still at the back of the chapel was a woman in her early 30s. Her skin, a deep, rich brown, caught the light as she stepped from shadow into clarity. Her figure was elegant in a simple black dress. No frills, no flash, only quiet dignity. Her natural hair was pulled into a soft, low puff, and her eyes, her eyes were calm and still, like that no longer expected to be seen. Her name was Naomi. Naomi Bennett, the adopted daughter of Charles and Margaret Bennett, the one they rarely mentioned unless they had to. She hadn't planned to speak today. Most in the chapel had silently hoped she wouldn't. When Naomi walked in, murmurs stirred the room. Not angry, just awkward, uncomfortable. "I didn't know she would come. They haven't been in touch for years, right?" Everyone knew the family portraits. Ryan and Caleb, the handsome white sons, front and center. The golden retriever. The backyard barbecues. The picture-perfect family. Naomi had never appeared in those images. And long ago, she stopped expecting to. She had been adopted at 7 years old, pulled from the foster care system after losing her biological mother. At first, she believed she had been saved, chosen. But over time, that belief withered beneath lingering stares, half-jokes, and silences that screamed louder than any words. She wasn't mistreated, not in the way people usually mean, but she wasn't embraced either. She existed like a guest who had overstayed their welcome, in a home whose owners didn't know how to ask them to leave. Still, she came today. She drove across state lines, Saturday through 2 hours of polished eulogies, listened as Ryan spoke about their father's unwavering sense of fairness, and Caleb choked up recalling their mother's endless love for family. Naomi did not cry. She had cried all her tears years ago. And now, to the surprise of everyone, even Ryan and Caleb narrowing their eyes from the front row, Naomi stepped forward. Each step echoed lightly across the polished floor. The sound of her low heels clicking made people hold their breath. As she passed the rows of faces, some turned away, some stared, some seemed frozen. At the podium, Naomi didn't touch the microphone, didn't clear her throat. She simply stood there, letting the heavy silence gather around her. She scanned the room, the same room where once she'd been told to smile bigger for family photos, where relatives would whisper, "She's sweet," but where her presence was always too visible and yet too invisible. And then, in a warm and steady voice, Naomi said, "Thank you all for being here today." Naomi had always known that family could be complicated, but she had learned early that being adopted and being accepted were not the same thing. Not even close. She was 7 when she first walked into the Bennett home. A 2-story colonial with white shutters, a pristine lawn, and a porch swing that creaked softly in the breeze. It looked like something out of a magazine. Neighbors dropped off casseroles. Strangers called the Bennett saints. How wonderful of them, they said, to take in one of those kids. Naomi remembered standing there clutching her small backpack, surrounded by smiling faces. Margaret Bennett, polished and perfect, knelt in front of her and said, "From now on, you're one of us." Charles Bennett ruffled her hair and said with a booming laugh, "We don't see color in this house." At 7, Naomi didn't quite understand. By 10, she did. It meant ignoring the stares at church. It meant pretending not to notice that Ryan and Caleb rarely introduced her as their sister. It meant laughing off an uncle's comments about that hair. It meant swallowing every sting, every slight. because they said they loved her, and love apparently was supposed to be enough. Ryan and Caleb were older, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, effortlessly confident. They had shared jokes, shared memories, shared photo albums Naomi was never part of. Even when she stood in the room, she was not in the frame. They never hit her, never said anything obviously cruel. But cruelty has many forms, and indifference is among the sharpest. At school, they ignored her. At home, they teased just enough to sting, always brushed off with, "Just kidding," or, "You're too sensitive." Whenever Naomi tried to speak up, Margaret would say, "Boys will be boys," and Charles would sigh and tell her, "They don't mean anything by it." It was gaslighting wrapped in hugs. 1,000 tiny cuts covered up with band-aids and polite smiles. Naomi learned to shrink not in size, but in presence. She learned how to disappear into the background, how to silence herself. Even when she wanted to scream, she learned how to say, "Thank you," even when the words tasted like betrayal. Today, sitting near the back of the chapel, nothing felt different. Ryan gave her a stiff nod when she walked in. Caleb mumbled, "Hey," without meeting her gaze. Neither offered a seat in the front row. A distant cousin handed her a program without a smile. Another whispered, "I didn't know she was still around." To them, she might as well be the florist. She sat in the second-to-last pew, surrounded by people who once praised her bravery for being adopted, but who never truly claimed her as family. They mourned the same two people she once called Mom and Dad, but their grief came from presence. Naomi's came from absence. She mourned not just their deaths, but the love she had chased and never caught. And still she came. Not because anyone expected her, not because anyone asked, but because she remembered being 7, standing in that hallway, believing that maybe, just maybe, she had found home. Years later, she was still trying to figure out if she ever had. The eulogies came in smooth, polished waves, each speech more glowing and effortless than the last. Charles and Margaret Bennett. People said they had opened their hearts and their home to anyone in need. They were praised as loving parents, a model family, kind, welcoming, grounded in faith. The words floated through the chapel like flower petals, light, polished, and hollow. Naomi sat still, her hands folded gently in her lap, her face unreadable. To those watching, she seemed politely present, perhaps even grateful. But behind her calm surface, memories stirred, like dust caught in a shaft of sunlight. The version of the Bennetts being painted here wasn't exactly false, but it was carefully edited. No one mentioned Thanksgiving when she was 12, when Margaret had gently but firmly asked for just the core family in the annual photo, and guided Naomi to sit off to the side. She remembered smiling anyway, making herself small, hoping her pain would be visible. It never was. No one mentioned the day Charles's wallet went missing, and the only person asked to empty their pockets was Naomi at 15. She had cried for hours in the bathroom. Later, they told her, "We had to check everyone, sweetheart. It wasn't about you." But it always was. No one brought up the family trips she wasn't invited to, spring break in Colorado, summer in Maine. They said the cabin was too small, the flights too expensive. It would just be easier this way. And when, at 17, Naomi finally told Margaret through trembling lips, "I don't feel like I belong here," the only reply had been, "You've all a little too emotional, Naomi. Try to be grateful." That word had followed her for years, trailing every dismissal, every silence. You should be grateful just to be here. But Naomi hadn't come today to express gratitude. She had come for something else, something heavier than mourning. In her purse, folded neatly, was a letter. The envelope was worn, the ink slightly smudged, the name scrawled in Margaret's careful hand. Naomi. She had found it weeks ago, buried behind a jewelry drawer she had never been allowed to open. She had never known it existed. And once she read it, she understood why. The letter was short, only 2 pages, but it contained what Margaret had never dared say out loud in over 30 years. Margaret apologized. She apologized for letting Ryan and Caleb treat Naomi differently, for pretending not to notice, for upholding a home where Naomi was both seen and unseen. Margaret admitted she had been afraid of being labeled a bad mother, afraid of confronting the ugliness within her own family. She had wanted to protect Naomi, but in choosing peace, she had chosen silence. And silence, in the end, was its own betrayal. "You were the bravest one in this family," Margaret wrote, "and I should have stood beside you." Naomi had read that letter every night since she found it. And now, sitting in this chapel full of people who still did not fully see her, she knew what she had to do. She hadn't come just to say goodbye. She had come to say what had gone unsaid for far too long. Not with anger, not for revenge, but because truth deserved a voice even when it made others uncomfortable. Quietly, Naomi slid her fingers into her purse, touching the letter. And then, she stood, not hurried, not hesitant, but with the calm certainty of someone who finally knew she had every right to be here. The chapel fell into a thick, weighty silence, as if even the air itself was holding its breath. The sunlight filtering through the stained glass windows seemed to pause mid-air. Naomi Bennett, the sister they had never fully embraced, began her slow, steady walk toward the podium. The sound of her low heels tapping the polished floor was louder than the organ music from earlier. Ryan and Caleb exchanged uneasy glances, their faces taut with confusion and something else, a flicker of fear. Naomi moved with a quiet grace, neither rushing nor apologizing, as if she had every right to stand there because she did. When she reached the podium, she placed her hands lightly on either side of the wood, anchoring herself. She didn't fidget with the microphone. She didn't clear her throat. She simply looked out across the sea of faces, faces that for so long had looked past her rather than at her. And she spoke. Her voice was soft but clear, each word dropping like a pebble into still water. "I was 7 years old the first time I walked through the Bennett front door." She paused, letting the words sink deep into the room. "I remember the scent of Mom's perfume. I remember Dad's laugh, loud and sudden, like thunder. I remember thinking maybe, just maybe, I had finally found a place to belong." A few people shifted in their seats. Ryan sat stiffly, arms folded. Caleb stared at the floor. Naomi continued, her tone unwavering. "Growing up there wasn't always easy. Sometimes love was given in ways that were hard to recognize. Sometimes it wasn't given at all." There was no accusation in her voice, no bitterness. Just truth, laid bare for anyone brave enough to hear it. Then, with hands that didn't tremble, Naomi reached into her purse. She drew out a folded, yellowed piece of paper, edges worn, the ink faded with time. She held it up for everyone to see. "After Mom passed," Naomi said, "I found a letter, addressed to me." A ripple of whispers stirred the chapel, but Naomi remained still, calm, grounded. She unfolded the paper with great care, as if handling something sacred, and she began to read. "My dearest Naomi, I'm sorry." 3 words, direct, no softening. And suddenly, the chapel was no longer just a room of mourners. It was a room full of witnesses. Naomi's voice didn't waver as she read Margaret's confession, how she had regretted standing silent when others made Naomi feel small, how she had regretted pretending everything was fine, how she had watched and done too little for too long. "You deserve better," Margaret wrote, "and I should have fought harder for you." Tears welled up in the eyes of some in the pews, though notably not in Ryan's or Caleb's. And just when the weight of the letter seemed almost too much to bear, Naomi turned to the final part. Her voice softened, almost a whisper, but somehow it filled every corner of the chapel. "I have made arrangements," Margaret had written, "so that the first place you ever placed your hope will always belong to you." Naomi lowered the letter. She looked out at the sea of stunned faces and said simply, "Mom left me the house." The chapel gasped as one. Heads snapped toward Ryan and Caleb, who sat frozen, their faces twisted with shock and disbelief. Naomi didn't smirk. She didn't gloat. She simply folded the letter back into her purse, with the same careful tenderness one might use to tuck a sleeping child into bed. Then she looked back across the room, her gaze soft but unshakable. "I didn't come here for revenge," she said. "I came because I love them. I came because even imperfect love deserves to be acknowledged. I came because truth deserves a voice, even when it makes people uncomfortable." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of things left unsaid for too long, full of truths finally too big to be ignored. Naomi stepped away from the podium, her back straight, her footsteps steady. She had said what needed to be said. She had honored the truth. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't asking for permission to exist. The chapel remained silent, long after Naomi stepped down from the podium. No one moved, no one clapped. It wasn't that kind of moment. It was a silence thick with weight, the kind that settles when a truth long buried is finally pulled into the light. Naomi returned to her seat at the back of the room, her spine straight, her footsteps steady. She didn't look at Ryan. She didn't look at Caleb. It didn't matter anymore. She hadn't spoken for them. She had spoken for herself and for the little girl she once was, the one who had once clutched a teddy bear too tightly, sitting on a porch swing, wishing someone would tell her she belonged. The service continued. The pastor offered a final blessing. The organ hummed a low, solemn tune. But to Naomi, it all felt far away now, like a river she was no longer standing beside. She sat still, feeling the day settle deep into her bones. Because today, she had chosen truth over comfort. She had chosen forgiveness over bitterness. And she had chosen herself. When the final amen whispered through the room and the congregation rose, Naomi stayed seated for just a moment longer, letting it all sink in, letting it all settle. And then she stood quietly, steadily. People began to file out, some sneaking glances her way, others looking deliberately away. Some offered small, tight smiles, futile attempts to bridge years of silent distance. Naomi met them with polite nods. No more, no less. She owed no one anything. Up near the front, Ryan and Caleb were speaking in low, tense voices with the estate attorney. Naomi caught a glimpse of Caleb's pale, drawn face, tight with anger and disbelief. And Ryan's jaw set into a hard, bitter line. They hadn't known. They hadn't seen it coming. And now they would have to live with it just as Naomi had lived with their indifference for so many years. But Naomi didn't revel in their discomfort. She didn't savor it. She felt only freedom. As she stepped out onto the chapel steps, the afternoon sun warmed her face. A soft breeze tugged at the hem of her black dress. Naomi closed her eyes for a moment, breathing deeply. She let the sunlight kiss her skin, let the wind lift the invisible weights she had carried for so long. For the first time, in what felt like forever, Naomi wasn't carrying anyone else's expectations. She wasn't carrying shame that didn't belong to her. She wasn't carrying the crushing need to prove she deserved to exist. She carried only herself, and that was enough. Before she left the chapel steps, Naomi turned back once, not with sadness, not with anger, but with a quiet, fierce gratitude. They had tried to erase her from their story, tried to crop her out of the photographs, to tuck her away neatly in the margins. But in the end, she was the one who wrote the final chapter.